My story takes place a few years ago. I'm a 25-year-old female now, but back then I was the ripe age of 23 and had a sudden stroke of luck. I'd saved up for my first home, and in my search, I came across a fairly old Victorian in a rural neighborhood of Port Perry, Ontario. The house was beautiful, well priced, and close to my place of work. Without much of a second thought, I snatched it up, and within a matter of weeks, I was moving into my new home. I remember the day I moved in vividly. I stood on the small white cobblestone pathway leading up to the wooden wraparound porch stairs, grinning up at the house's vacant windows. Its brick was a pale yellow, recently repainted, and its intricate trimmings a bright white that contrasted sharply with the coal-black shingles of the roof, its pointed spires silhouetted against the spotless blue sky. I had sighed contentedly, tearing my eyes away from the house and glancing around the rest of the property. It had been mid-fall, October 15th to be exact, and the forest behind the house was a patchwork of quilt of colors. The leaves fell gently to the ground, carried by a crisp autumn breeze blanketing the forest floor in the earthly tones of autumn. Focusing my attention back on the task at hand, I began making my way up the path, my box of kitchen utensils in hand. The movers I'd hired strode past me, throwing me the occasional smile and asking me where I wanted things. I would reply politely with directions. On my third trip out to the truck, I got the distinct feeling of being stared at. Turning around, I expected to find one of the men, but instead, I found that I was alone. Before I had the opportunity to brush it off, however, I caught movement in my peripheral vision in one of the upstairs windows. I just barely caught the silhouette of a person slip out of view. It was there 1 second and gone the next, so quickly I blinked a few times, thinking that last night's insomnia had made me imagine things. I made a mental note to go to bed early that night, and with a sense of unease, I entered the house. Little did I know that first day would be the beginning of a series of disturbing encounters that would make me a local hero and a firm believer in the unknown. That same night, I lay awake in my new bedroom, staring up at the ceiling as the sounds of nature drifted lazily through my cracked window. Back in the city, there had been a constant barrage of noise every night, and I'd realized quickly that it would take me time to adjust to the lack thereof. Eventually, sleep claimed me, and I drifted off to the soft sound of crickets chirping out in the woods. At first, I floated in a warm void, barely lucid as I drifted, then gradually the abyss began to morph and change into something familiar, shapes forming around me as they emerged from the all-consuming darkness. As they formed, light followed, and then I suddenly found my world illuminated by the soft glow of a single lamp. I was in my living room. The lamp glowed faintly as I blinked. Getting my bearings, glancing to my right, I saw the front hall and the giant bay window above my couch. As I peered out of it, a waxing moon glared back at me from above high the treetops. Inching closer, I squinted, thinking I could make out a figure in the distance facing the house. They stood still as stone, hidden in the shadows of the tree line, and even with the yard between us, I felt their stare penetrating through me. Instinctively, I cowered away from the window, feeling the need to put as much effort space between myself and the strange being outside as possible. In a panic, I blinked rapidly, and the next second, I was looking into one of the most mangled faces I'd ever seen. She stood at no more than 4 feet, her skinny frame draped in a blood-soaked nightgown that, upon closer inspection, I believed had once been a crisp white. It was torn and muddied in certain places, as if she had recently clawed her way out of her own grave. And to add to the picture, twigs and leaves had entangled themselves in her greasy black hair. To my horror, as I took her, unblinkingly chunks of her skull almost seemed to be missing, exposing the inside of her rotted cranium to the elements. She stared back at me with a chillingly dead expression in her empty sockets, slowly oozing a chunky dark substance down her decomposing cheeks. The skin on her face sagged and ashen gray pocketed with craters of rot that revealed glistening white patches of bone. I watched trembling as she haltedly lifted a broken arm and placed her pale hand on the window. She opened her mouth and I could almost hear the crack of a bone as if it were the first time she had tried to speak in decades. She mouthed only 2 words, "Help me." Snapping out of it, I screamed, stumbling back from the window. This only seemed to agitate her, though, as she began beating her small fists on the glass, howling her demand, "Help me, help me, help me, help me, help me." The dark substance seemed to thicken as it poured from her eyes, soaking her decayed face in crimson streaks. I clapped both my hands over my ears, screwing my eyes shut as her shrill wails pierced through me, dropping to my knees as I began to cry. "Okay," I pleaded over her anguished screams. "I'll help you, but please just let me go." Silence. It was as if someone had unplugged a speaker and the music had suddenly been cut off. I was too frightened to open my eyes, but I was forced to when I felt the splash of cold liquid hit my forehead. She stared back at me inches from my face now, drops of blood splattering onto my skin on my forehead as she hovered over me. "Wake up." I shot up in my bed, flailing blindly as I screamed, tearing at the sheets entangled around my sweaty body. Blinking away at tears, I cried out as sunlight suddenly burned my eyes, flinching back against my headboard as I shook violently. I stayed like that for almost an hour, crying softly to myself as I tried to come to terms with what I had just gone through. That nightmare had been like nothing I'd ever experienced in my life, and I even thought I was still early in the morning. I refused to go back to sleep. Eventually, I pulled myself together and managed to get out of bed, but not before turning every light I could find on in the house. I felt tempted to chide myself for acting so childishly, but I was too terrified to care at the time. I got showered, dressed, and did my makeup, grabbing my things for work and preparing to rush out the door when something stopped me in my tracks. On my kitchen counter, beside my car keys, was a single drop of crimson. At the sight of it, I gasped, and without thinking, I snatched my keys and ran out of the house. I went through the motions of that day, barely aware of my surroundings as I worked. My mind was still back at my house, going over all the plausible possibilities for why I would find a single fresh drop of blood in the one place there shouldn't be one. I exhausted all theories, but by the end of the day, I was drained and confused, knowing for a fact that it hadn't been there the day before and that it wasn't mine. As I drove through my neighborhood, I slowed to a stop at the curb, glaring up at my new home. It loomed over me in the setting sun, its windows dark and empty, as if the structure itself were glaring back. At that point, I had been determined to brush it off as nothing, chalking it up to having an explanation I couldn't think of at the time. I wanted to enjoy my new home, and as I turned to grab my things and lock my car, that's exactly what I had planned to do. Until I turned back around and saw that single light was turned on upstairs in my bedroom window. My first thought was that someone had broken in and slipped up, so I called the police. They came minutes later, and after a thorough sweep, they came back with nothing to show for it. There had been no sign of forced entry or anything taken. They'd searched high and low for a culprit, but the only thing they found was my bedroom light on. After a short lecture on not wasting the police department's time and remembering to turn off my lights before leaving the house to prevent scares like this, they left, and I found myself standing alone on my front porch. Nervously, I sucked in a breath between my teeth and cracked the door open. I walked into the front parlor, looking around apprehensively, but finding nothing out of place. Turning on the lights, I sauntered over to the kitchen counter, and to my surprise, it was clean. The drop of blood was gone. The house was eerily silent, but an atmosphere of heaviness hung in the air. I'd never noticed it before, but as I stood in my kitchen, it almost felt like the air itself was trying to suffocate me. Suddenly, the lights began to flicker. I jumped. Looking at the old bulbs in my kitchen ceiling, I watched them, almost mesmerized as the flickering continued, wondering vaguely if I'd have to call someone to come and check the fuse box. Without warning, they flared and almost blinding white seared my eyes. I cried out, covering my face in a vain effort to shield them. And it was a good thing I did too, because seconds later I heard the telling pop, pop, pop of the bulbs exploding one by one above me. Glass rained down around me, scattering noisily at my feet as I stood frozen to the spot. Shakily, I removed my hands, finding that the entire house was in darkness. The only light came through the window over my kitchen sink, illuminating the room well enough to see the shards glinting on the ground surrounding me. I glanced around, shocked, unbelieving of what had just happened, but the worst was yet to come. As my eyes adjusted to the sudden lack of light, I noticed movement at the top of the stairs from my peripheral vision. Slowly, I lifted my head to look at the source. Sitting on the top step was the girl from my nightmare. What? I panted, my eyes almost popping out of their sockets. The fuck? Letting out a low, demonic chuckle, she stood and began descending the stairs. Clutching the banister in her splintered hand, she began to speak. You, she hissed lowly, her empty eyes burning into mine, have not kept your promise to me. Rooted to the spot, all I could do was shake in terror. You have done nothing to help me, she continued, growing closer and emitting a kind of rage a small child shouldn't be capable of. You chose to forget me today, just like everyone else. I'm so sorry. I croaked out, tears cascading down my face. Please, just don't hurt me. She stood in front of me now, the only thing separating us being a foot of kitchen tile. She was noticeably shorter than me, being that she was so young, but somehow I felt like the child standing before an authority figure. She stared up at me silently for a moment, her ashen cheeks glistening with the slowly dripping blood. The droplets hit the floor between us in deafening silence, splattering softly on the ceramic. With each drop that hit the floor, I flinched. I will give you one more chance, she said softly, her bloody sockets unblinking. Find me. With that, she vanished, leaving me alone in the darkness. Not wasting any time, I broke out of my paralysis and bolted out the door. Glass crunched underfoot as I ran, tears streaming down my face until my feet hit the pavement and I practically flung myself on my car's driver's side door. Hyperventilating, I nearly yanked it off as I threw it open and climbed inside, slamming it behind me. In the silence, I trembled, gasping for breath as I struggled to regain control over my breathing before I passed out. I stared down at my hands with blurry eyes, gripping my steering wheel so tightly in my fists my knuckles had gone painfully looking white. It could have been 20 minutes to an hour before I had the courage to start driving. When I did, I was still in a daze, unsure of how to think or where to go until I pulled into a quiet street, spotting a dingy old motel on the corner. Knowing I would rather spend time with the roaches than whatever was in my house, I pulled into the parking lot. I got out, paid, and took my meager belongings with me to my room. Sitting on the edge of my bed, I let out a sigh of relief before deciding to take a much-needed shower. In the shower, as I lathered my hair with cheap complimentary shampoo, and an idea occurred to me. The ghost, or whatever she was, she wanted me to find her, so that could only mean that she'd been someone at one point, maybe even someone with a loving family. The more I thought about it, the more I wondered if something had happened to her in that house. After getting out, wrapping in a towel, I sat on the edge of my bed, drying my hair, Glancing to my right, I noticed my work laptop, and on a whim, I opened it up and began to do a search on the house. To my surprise, the first thing that popped up was an article. As I read, I paled more with every sentence. In this article, it talked about the previous owners of my house. They had been a family of 4, a husband, a wife, with 2 young children that smiled happily for the camera in a picture provided by the article. At the time, the oldest was a 7-year-old boy named Jonathan, and his younger sister Madison had been no more than 5. I gasped loudly as I saw their daughter, recognizing her right away. It was her. According to the report, Madison had been declared a missing person when she had mysteriously vanished from their home's backyard almost 13 years ago. The family had been beside themselves. Her older brother, the last person to see her alive, claimed that a man had approached them and had lured her away into the woods behind the house. Although they had searched the surrounding area tirelessly, they had found no one with the description of the brother that had provided and turned up no sign of Madison. Eventually, with no leads, Madison's case had gone cold and was forgotten. With a shaking hand, I covered my mouth, tears pooling in my eyes for the second time that night as I recalled her words. "You chose to forget me today, just like everyone else." "No, Madison, I won't forget you, like everyone else," I whispered into the silence, a sudden surge of determination bringing me to my feet. I stared down at the innocent face of the girl on my screen, a fiery rage swelling inside of me. Whoever had taken the smile off that child's face, I thought angrily, would finally answer to justice for their heinous crimes. Closing the lid of my laptop, I went to get dressed. It took me all of 20 minutes to return to the house. By now, it was 4 a.m. and my eyes burned as I struggled to focus on the road. By some miracle, though, I had made it back without getting in an accident. And the minute I laid eyes on the looming structure of my home, I was suddenly wide awake with adrenaline. Stepping out of the car, I slowly crept my way up the cobblestone path that cut through my yard. The front door creaked as I pushed it open, stepping into the front hall. The house was exactly as I'd left it in hours before, glass strewn everywhere on the kitchen floor and crushed by my earlier mad dash to escape. This time, though, I stood silently at the threshold. There was no crushing oppression in the air. If anything, it was tinged with deep sorrow and underlying feeling of depression. "Madison," I called out softly, apprehension stringing at the back of my throat. "Honey, I'm so sorry I ran away, but I think I figured out a way to help you." Out of the corner of my eye, a shadow shifted at the end of the hall in the darkness. There was a beat of silence. "How?" came a faint but hopeful whisper. "I need you to lead me to the last place you remember being when you were alive, or became a spirit." I replied back gently, praying she took to the idea. Slowly, she lurched towards me from down the hallway. It took everything in me not to run away, screaming again as she approached, limping toward me until she came to a complete stop at the edge of the doorway, cast in the faint light of the moon pouring in from behind me. Shadows, much darker than I felt they should have been, stretched across her disfigured face and body, giving her an almost demonic appearance. But I knew better. Swallowing my fear, I spoke. "Let me get a shovel and a compass, and I promise, Madison, I won't stop looking until I find you." She smiled at me with a mouthful of bloody broken teeth. Finally. Never in my life did I expect to be following the ghost of a dead girl through the woods at night. I have to admit, it felt like some kind of bizarre nightmare at the time. But as I trialed after her, I pinched myself repeatedly, but never managed to wake up. I wondered vaguely how it felt for her for the past 13 years. This thought propelled me forward into the cold night, my breath coming out in foggy puffs as I kept pace with her at a distance. She was only a few feet ahead of me, the slim silhouette of her back a beacon in the darkness that engulfed us. We could have walked for an hour or more by the time we'd arrived, but the night showed no sign of fading. The only thing I knew was that my feet already hurt and that we were deep into the forest, the house long behind us. Without warning, she had come to a sudden stop, barely giving me enough time to avoid her before we collided, although I doubted anything would have happened if we had. "Here," she spoke, her broken voice barely above a whisper. She pointed at a patch of ground covered by a heavy-looking rock. It seemed out of place compared to the rest of the forest, like it had been put there by someone on purpose. This immediately raised my suspicions, and I stepped into the patch of moonlight to stand beside her in the small clearing. "I woke up here years ago," she murmured, staring down at the stone with an unreadable expression. "All I remember from before that is that me and my brother had been playing in the house." I stepped forward, brandishing my shovel. The tempered steel glinted in the broken moonlight coming through the trees above, stirring a surreal feeling inside of me. "Well, this is as good of a place as any to start." With that, my shovel hit the earth as I began to dig. I dug under the stone, eventually managing to roll it to the side to offer myself more space to get at the earth beneath it. I dug where it had been, my suspicions growing with every pile of dirt that I tossed aside. God only knows how much time had passed before the sun started to peek between the trees and I hit more than soil. My breath caught as my shovel snagged on something buried deep. Taking a shaky breath, I prepared for the worst, and I began shoveling more frantically. With each pile of dirt I flung over my shoulder, I uncovered what looked like a bundle of old blankets with something inside. Before I knew it, I was standing over an open grave. The blankets, although dirty and worn, were noticeably soaked in places with dried brown stains, and the stench of death was undeniable, even though the body was years old. Slowly, I knelt over her and gently pulled back some of the blankets. What stared back at me was the familiar decomposed face of Madison. I covered my mouth with a clammy hand, fighting back the urge to vomit. I stumbled back from her grave, tripping and slamming into the trunk of a tree behind me by accident. I stood there for a moment, shaken to my core, before slowly sliding to my knees, feeling them hit the damp earth beneath me. I cried inconsolably, both with relief and a whirlwind of different emotions. Madison had finally been found, and as the dawn chased away the darkness, I felt her behind me. A small hand touched my shoulder as if she were trying to comfort me. Not daring to look up, I spoke a single sentence. "I found you." Not long after I found Madison's body, the truth of her death finally came to light. Her skeleton was exhumed from its grave and her case was reopened. I was questioned by police, and with nothing up my sleeve, I told them the entire truth. In the end, they had no choice but to accept my testimony, but not really. They practically wrote me off as crazy and put it down as an accidental discovery in their reports. Hence, I became the woman that accidentally solved a murder in my small town, and even a bit of a celebrity. An extensive investigation was done on the body, revealing some disturbing truths. They had found the DNA of her older brother on her clothing, among other things, such as a broken neck and blunt force trauma to her head. This trauma, according to the coroner, was an ultimate cause of her death. When her brother, who was an adult by then, had been brought in for questioning, he came clean about everything. According to his confession, he and his sister had been playing near the top of the stairs in their home when he had accidentally been too rough and ended up pushing her down. The only one who had been home at the time was their father, and he had been the one who discovered his son sobbing hysterically at the bottom of the staircase over the broken body of his sister. Panicking in an attempt to save his son's future, their father had wrapped her body up in blankets and left the house for hours, burying her deep in the woods before coming back and cleaning up the crime scene thoroughly. After that, they'd come up with a cover story, and he had vowed to take it to their own graves. It seems the only thing they weren't counting on was their daughter haunting the house she died in. I watched with a heavy heart on the local news as they were convicted of unintentional manslaughter and taken away in cuffs. Outside the courthouse, Madison's mother stood surrounded by family off to the side, crying helplessly as she watched them go. Later, I received an unexpected invitation for Madison's funeral in the mail. Feeling a sense of moral obligation, I attended. Upon arrival, the first face I saw was Madison's mother. She looked rough. She looked aged overnight. She looked at barely 5 feet tall, clad in loose-fitting black dress that hung on her thin frame. Her shoulders were hunched as if she carried the weight of the world, clutching a handkerchief to her heavying chest, and a dark bags stood out against her lined, pale face, framed by barely tamed black curls streaking with gray. We made eye contact, and before I could react, she was standing in front of me. Her lip trembled as she clutched my hand in hers, looking up at me with pleading eyes that drove a spike through my heart. "Thank you for finding my little girl," she sobbed out brokenly. A few tears followed the wrinkles in her cheeks. "I overheard from the police how you found her, and I know they don't believe you, but I do." She paused as if searching for her next words. Have you seen her again since?" she asked quietly, but her words carried no less weight. I thought back to my life for the past few months. Since that night in the woods, I hadn't seen Madison, but in my heart, I felt she was already doing better than she had been, wherever she was now. "No, I am sorry," I replied, squeezing her hand with a sympathetic look. "I just wish I could see her one more time," she said softly, her eyes brimming with unshed tears. "I've been hoping for years that she was still alive, that she would come home, but I think I knew it would come to this." Her words had crushed me. I thought about my own mother, how she'd done everything in her power to protect me from the evil in the world, and how much we'd both trusted my father and sister. The realization of the pain she must be in consumed me, and before I could stop myself, I was pulling her into a tight hug. She went stiff for a moment, unsure of how to react. Then, before I could pull away and awkwardly apologize, she slid her arms around me, hugging me back. We stood like that for a moment, something unspoken passing between us. When we broke apart, she was smiling sadly. "Thank you. You have no idea how much I needed that," she said. "I feel like God sent you to me as my comforter." Too emotional to speak, I only nodded. "Would you like to sit with me in the front row during the service?" she asked. I smiled, a single tear streaking my cheek. Yes, of course. The service was a solemn affair, but not without love. Madison was honored and cherished by everyone who'd known her in the short time she'd been alive. And when it was time to put her body to rest, I quietly followed the procession to the graveyard behind the church. Gathered around Madison's open grave, I squeezed her mother's trembling shoulder as they slowly lowered her into the ground. I fought hard to blink back tears, a whirlwind of emotion sweeping through me as the preacher spoke his final prayers. Without warning, Madison's mother suddenly stiffened, jerking her head to the right and gasping loudly. I followed her gaze only to find a familiar face. 10 feet from her grave, next to an ancient oak, stood Madison and an unfamiliar young man. This time, however, Madison was the perfect picture of clean. She was standing next to the man in a pure white dress, her loose black hair falling around her youthful face in soft ringlets. The longer I looked, the more it felt like she was almost glowing with a soft, ethereal white light. The man next to her was also handsome, dressed in a crisp white suit. And as I continued to stare, barely breathing, I noticed a set of pristine white wings tucked neatly behind his back. Madison waved at us joyfully, tears streaking down her rosy cheeks as she mouthed a silent, "Thank you." Smiling tearfully, I mouthed back 2 words, "You're welcome." Turning to the angel, Madison took his hand in hers, nodding up at him. Entwining his fingers with hers gently, he flashed us a warm smile before they turned and began to walk away, both of them fading into the afternoon sunlight as they did. In the early days of February, just before my senior year, I was prompted by my father to undertake a rite of passage, as he called it. I was to be left alone to fend for myself in a section of Tennessee's Cherokee National Forest for 3 days and 2 nights. I was against the trip from the beginning, sure. I liked hunting and camping, but this was extreme, too extreme for my tastes. But it was tradition, passed down from father to son in my family for generations. Who was I to break tradition? So against my reservations and against the feeling that this was a stupid idea, I packed up my backpack and grabbed my .30-06 bolt action rifle and climbed into the cab of my dad's pickup. It was a long drive, broken only by stilted attempts at conversation and the heater going full blast as the tires rolled past the endless concrete. I was a little pissed that my dad was basically forcing this on me, and our uneasy silence only made the hours feel like days. We only stopped once at a gas station about 10 miles from our cabin. The stench of unleaded and a cheap convenience store hamburger would be the last remnants of civilization I'd see for the next 3 days. I mechanically swallowed my burger and slurped down the watery Coke filled with too much ice as we turned off the highway and got on the rural back roads. It was 15 miles of dirt to my dad's cabin, and his grandfather had left him, which would, in turn, be left to me. It was tradition, after all. But I wouldn't be getting the luxury of a cabin. No. We were parking the truck, and my father would be driving me up deeper into the woods on a 4-wheeler to a random, undisclosed point. I would then have 3 days to find my way back. If I succeeded, I'd become a man in my dad's eyes, and we'd also be getting a new swimming pool for the summer. It was bribery, but I would be going into my senior year in August, and having a big pool would cement my popularity. It was vain, and I was doing this for mostly selfish reasons, but I also wanted to make my dad proud. I stepped out of the toasted truck to the calm, frigid forest air. The cabin was a small 2-story log affair, worn from age, but obviously well maintained. A new wooden wraparound porch had been built last summer and was in need of staining that we'd never got around to, but otherwise the cabin was pristine. It was a tremendously peaceful place, far removed from the troubles of civilization, and I felt like I was intruding on hallowed ground. I brushed off the shiver that clawed down my spine and buttoned my long coat to my neck. Immediately, most of the chill went away. I shook off my unease. I didn't want to admit it, but a part of me was looking forward to the trip. Some primal part of me relished the opportunity to put all the survival skills I'd been taught over the years to the test. Before I could take a step to the cabin, my dad came around the front of the truck and held out his hand. "Thomas, hand me your bag," he demanded in a curt, no-nonsense tone. My dad and I looked so much alike in the face. The same unruly dark hair and deep-set eyes, but I could never hope to measure up to his terrifying drill sergeant voice. As he told me to hand him my backpack, I did so without question, and he immediately went inside, telling me to wait on the porch. I marched across the wood and sat in the rocking chair while my dad bustled around inside. Pots and pans clanged and metal scraped against metal as he worked. breaking the sounds of the forest around me. For a half an hour, my dad busied himself with my bag before the screen door creaked and he ambled back outside. I loaded everything you'll need for 3 days in the bag. You have a couple days of food, but it's only for an emergency. I also added a flare gun for an actual emergency. Dad kept his voice rough and only used that tone with me when he wanted me to really pay attention to him. He had a good reason. As fun and full of tradition as this experience would be for me, I was still spending several nights alone in the woods and the untamed wilderness. Anything could happen. He handed me back the bag, and it was stuffed full. A lot had been added to it, so much that the string strained against the nylon fabric. I hefted it to my shoulder and thought it was much heavier than before. It wasn't cumbersome or unwieldy. I could carry it all day, and I didn't think it would bother me. After he handed me the pack, we unloaded the four-wheeler from the back of his truck, and we set off up the small walking trail next to the house. From memory, the path went on for dozens of miles and followed the stream as it snaked through the wilderness. We rode until the dirt road ended and humanity fell away to the deep woods. The ridge got bumpy as we wound around trees and over small rocks for a minute. I was afraid of hazards. My dad was an experienced outdoorsman, though, and he knew these woods well. A few hours later, we'd apparently reached the destination. It was a small clearing nestled under a copse. The remains of a previous campsite, long since put out, rested the center of the dirt surrounded by a circle of rocks. I was up here scouting a couple weeks ago, so I know the route I'd take to get back, he said cheekily. Be careful, son, and call me if there's an emergency. I'm only a few hours away, and I should be able to see the flare if there's trouble. Yeah, because I'll be able to get a signal out here, I replied, holding up my now useless phone. Well, there's always the flare gun, but I'm confident you'll be fine, and besides, the flare's really only if you decide to give up, he said, laughing. With a parting wave, he departed, rolling back down the mountain and leaving me stranded in the woods for 3 days. The first thing I did was take inventory and catalog my belongings. I undid the pack and carefully emptied its contents onto the ground. I had a pair of long johns, some extra socks and underwear, a box of matches, a hunting knife, and a miniature shovel. A Ziploc bag filled with blend of spices and a canteen of water, 2 days of vacuum-sealed rations and water pouches, and the flare gun, along with my hammock and blanket. I had everything I needed to make camp and survive if my hunting skills proved to be lacking. I had over 30 miles of wilderness to hack through before I hit the main roads and could circle back to the cabin on the main road. Dad told me it should take me at least 2 days, 3 if I didn't get lucky with my hunts. I had a few hours to kill before nightfall and wanted to get some miles in, find my bearings. The best bet, I thought, would be to hike along the stream until it ended. It was somewhat close to the trail, but not on it, as that would be cheating, but it would give me an excellent landmark to keep me oriented. So with mild hesitation, I packed up and set off through the woods. It had been a good couple of months since I'd last been in the woods, and I'd never been this deep in them, but it was quiet, only disturbed by the rustling of trees and the occasional scuffle of an animal nearby as I trudged over rough ground and rocks. Staying near or on the trail would have defeated the purpose of the experience, so I stayed off it as much as I could and only traveled through the woods themselves. Of course, it slowed my progress considerably, and I only managed to walk about 2 miles before I started thinking about stopping. I would have to hunt before it got dark if I didn't want to go hungry, and I only had an hour or two before the light fell enough to make hunting impossible. After searching around for about 10 minutes, I found a good spot to set up camp for the evening, and I dropped my bag and grabbed my rifle, chambered a cartridge, and double-checked the safety. My game was rabbit, since I didn't have the tools needed to string up and gut a deer. I set off and crept through the bush, looking for signs of a nearby den. Rabbits are most active at dawn or dusk, so it was the perfect time to hunt them. Less than 5 minutes later, I found signs of rabbit trails in the underbrush a few hundred yards from camp. I leaned against the tree just waiting. The rabbit I wanted appeared a half an hour later, hopping out of the brush without a care in the world. It was a plump eastern cottontail. It stopped and sniffed, giving me my opening. The crack of my rifle pierced the air. The cottontail dropped dead. I'd hit my mark, taking it in the neck so as not to spoil any of the meat. It was a decent-sized rabbit, more than enough for dinner. I bagged it and went back to camp. Light was fading as I reached my campsite, which made fire priority number 1. I grabbed the mini shovel and dug a small pit in the center of camp, spreading the loose dirt around the perimeter. I picked up a bundle of sticks and kindling, just clearing the site gave me ample dead wood to burn, so I piled a bundle in the ground with some dead leaves and twigs and got a nice fire going. When I had light to work by, I cleaned the rabbit, making sure not to perforate the bowels and remove the organs and skin. I walked away from camp and buried the offal and hide in a small hole next to a tree. When the meat was cleaned, I rubbed some spices into the meat to remove some of the taste of game and skewered it with a stick I'd sharpened. While the meat cooked over a makeshift spit, I tied my hammock to the only 2 trees close enough for it to work. By the time my bed was ready, I had to turn the meat and get it ready to eat. A sprinkle of seasoning garnished the piping hot meat, and I dug in when it was fully cooked. I wasn't the best cook and didn't have the right tools and ingredients, so the meat was a little dry and bland, but filled me up nicely, and I washed it down with a swig from my canteen. I even had leftovers. I wrapped them up in cloth and sat them by the fire, ready to be eaten for breakfast in the morning. With nothing else to do for the evening, and night had fallen an hour ago, I decided to turn in for the evening and get an early start in the morning. I had many miles to cover, and I would have to hunt again at some point the next day for dinner. I nodded off, listening to the sounds of the forest as they lulled me into a deep sleep. In the morning, I woke up refreshed from one of the best night's sleep I'd ever had, and was eager to take on the day. I was in such a good mood that it took me a few minutes to realize something was off. In the middle of packing up my hammock and gathering my supplies, I couldn't help but notice that the leftover rabbit was missing from next to the fire. I searched around for it in vain, thinking the wind might have caught it and blown it away from the camp, but there was nothing. I chalked it up to a wild animal, but that unsettled me. Deers didn't often eat meat, and I didn't think a deer would get anywhere near my campsite. The smoke from the embers of the fire would have been enough to keep most animals away. Black bears were common enough in the forest, but they should still be hibernating during this time of year. Right now, there wasn't anything larger than a deer in these woods, so unless it was a coyote, it had to have been a deer, but there were no tracks anywhere around my campsite, so no answers came to me. I packed up camp and went to relieve myself when I found something that confused and terrified the hell out of me. I went to piss by the tree where I buried the offal of the rabbit last night, and right where I buried them was a hole. It was rough with long claw marks, gouged deep into the dirt as if something had ripped into the ground to get what I buried. I'd buried them deep enough not to attract the scent of wild animals, and I'd never seen claw marks like the ones next to the tree. I didn't know what to make of them. Wild animals weren't that smart, and they were skittish by nature. No animal would risk getting close to a human unless they were starving, and no human had claws like the ones I'd found. Without hesitation, I grabbed my rifle and racked a cartridge. The air was calm, and birds sang through the treetops. It was a lovely morning, and I was petrified. I walked the camp in a circle, spreading out, searching for any tracks or signs. The only ones I'd found were some deer tracks about 100 yards from camp that were at least a day old. There was nothing else even remotely resembling the marks I'd found. There was nothing for me to find, and even though I was freaked out, I still had to hike back to civilization. As the miles wore on, I began to rationalize the experience, thinking it to be nothing more than a hungry animal looking for food and brave enough to sneak into my camp. I just hadn't buried the offal deep enough, and some critter had smelled it. That's all it was. As the day wore on, there was nothing to differentiate my delusions. The woods were normal, no ominous warnings, no foreboding feelings, just nature alive and well in the midday sun. I managed to bag another rabbit, purely on coincidence, as it scampered out of the tree line. I snapped off a shot, and my aim was lucky. I'd taken it in the head, which left a little of its skull behind, but it left the meat ripe for the taking. I'd made a good time through the woods, so I stopped and quickly cleaned the rabbit, leaving the offal and skin where they lay. If something wanted to eat them, then let it. After the rabbit was clean, I wrapped the meat in cloth and stowed it away. I was hungry from the hike and the fact that my breakfast had been stolen that morning, but I still wanted to put some more miles under my boots before it got dark. I wanted to be far away from my campsite, just in case. As the sunlight faded from the canopy and my aching feet demanded a break, I found a spot to set up camp. It was a small campsite, nestled up against a rocky mound that stretched skyward for a couple dozen feet, with a slanted shelf near the top. I felt comfortable having my back to the wall, and a brace of trees next to the rock ensured I could set up my hammock. I readied the campsite, built a roaring fire twice as large as the one last night just to scare away any nearby animals, and cooked the rabbit to perfection. I was ravenous and scarfed down the meat with gusto. Despite my hunger, there was still plenty of leftovers again, but this time I was careful to stow the meat inside my pack, which I kept next to my hammock. Exhaustion had worn me down from the many miles I'd walked that day. I was eager to get some sleep. I laid my head on my pillow and was out like a light. The stillness woke me, like a veil of silence had been draped over the woods. Not a single sound rose from the forest floor other than the rustling of the leaves in the wind, not even crickets. Animals instinctively go quiet in the presence of predators, but this was unlike anything I'd ever felt before. I lay in my hammock, straining my ears to listen to any sound I could. There was nothing but the wind. The fire had died out, leaving only coals that sparked every time a stiff breeze rolled in. The moon was fat in the sky and gave me ample light to see by as I stared up at the trees. For some reason, I was terrified to get up and look around. My rifle was next to me, resting by my head against the tree. I could grab it in seconds, and there was a round in the chamber, but I couldn't reach for my gun. I couldn't do anything other than stare straight ahead and try not to move an inch, because I realized something was watching me. It started as a tickle of paranoia on the back of my neck as my hair stood on end, but it grew to fear as sweat beaded on my forehead. There was a presence in the woods. Its eyes were on me, and it was angry. Pure, unadulterated malice oozed from just beyond my sight. Something was watching me, and it hated me. It's hard to describe the feeling, the anger that was directed toward me, but I knew what it was on a primal level, something instinctual, right alongside the fear of being alone in the dark. I knew that feeling too. The presence persisted for a few minutes and didn't fade. Sweat poured down my neck as I fought to stay still. Eventually, the silence and fear got to me, and I had to do something. I couldn't take it anymore and leapt from the hammock, hitting the ground hard. I ignored the pain radiating from my arms and scrambled for my rifle, scanning all around me, trying to find whatever it was. As I spun around, I saw it, perched on the rocks above me. For a single split second, a flash of neon blue eyes stared back at me from an angular, too pale body before it slunk out of sight. My heart pounded in my chest and my head felt fuzzy, like ants crawling over my brain. It became hard to breathe. I fought to keep from passing out. I was scared out of my mind because whatever that thing had been wasn't human and it wasn't an animal. It was a monster. I didn't sleep that night. I built up the fire and huddled around it, clutching my rifle till morning. Screw tradition, screw these woods. I was heading back to the cabin at first light, and I wasn't stopping till I reached it. Nothing else happened through the night, but as dawn broke over the mountains, my nerves were shot to hell and my eyes ached with the strain of keeping them open. I stumbled to my feet, kicked out the fire, slung my backpack over my shoulder. I left the hammock tied where it was and set off toward the stream. I was going to follow it to the trail, and I'd be back at the cabin well before nightfall. It took an hour of walking, stumbling over uneven terrain till I found the stream, and from there I found the worn trail. I followed it for hours as the sun rose high in the sky. I was so tired, but the fear of death and that monster were the only things that kept me putting one foot in front of the other. I was hungry, thirsty, and beyond everything else, utterly exhausted. But I kept pushing forward. No matter how slow and tired I was, I still had the rabbit tied up in my pack, but I couldn't stop and eat. As the day wore on, I began to recognize parts of the terrain, and I knew I was close to the cabin. I was so elated that I didn't pay attention to where I was walking and rolled my ankle on a small rock that jutted out from the side of the trail. I lost my balance and careened off and hit my head on a nearby tree branch. Everything went black. I awoke to dusk. I'd been out for a couple of hours, whether from the blow to the head or the exhaustion. Whichever it was, I was still in the woods, and night was coming quickly. The monsters never appeared during the daytime, so I thought I was safe in the light, but light was running out, and I still had a mile or so till I reached the cabin. I picked myself off the ground and dusted the dirt off. I grabbed my rifle, checked that it was still loaded, and I flipped the safety off. My finger stood a millimeter from the trigger, and I kept my head on a swivel as I hastily jogged the trail back to the cabin. Relief swept through me when I saw the wraparound porch come into view. I nearly sagged to my knees as I reached the cabin, just as the last of the orange bled from the purple skyline. I had made it back. "Dad," I yelled as I ran up on the porch. "Dad, we gotta go." I ran around to the front door and stood stock still as my blood ran cold. The door to the cabin was open, and my dad was lying halfway inside and halfway on the porch. He'd been mauled. His body was nothing but ribbons and scraps of flesh that only half resembled what a human should look like. I stared in silence, my mind not comprehending what I was seeing. He'd been wearing the red and black checked flannel shirt I'd got him for his birthday. It was the only way I could tell it was my dad. His face had been ripped from his skull. 2 white bones peeked out from his empty eye sockets. The stench was ungodly. A mixture of fresh meat and the iron tang of blood filled the air. I clutched at my stomach and hurled bile on the wooden floorboards, sinking to my knees as my throat burned raw as I heaved my guts out. Absolute panic gripped my sanity and took it for a joyride as I tried and failed to come to terms with the fact that my father was dead, had been ripped to pieces by whatever was outside stalking me in the dark. I had to leave. I had to get as far away from that place as I could, or else I'd be next. I screamed wordlessly and backed away from the porch. I turned and ran to the truck. It was my only avenue of escape, and I had to hurry. Night had fallen. I scrambled to the driver's side of the pickup and yanked on the handle hard enough to break it, but it held and opened the door after a second of sticking. I climbed into the cab and threw down the visor where my dad usually kept the keys, but they weren't there. The only other place they could be was in the pocket of my dad's jeans, and I would have to get them. Steeling myself for the inevitable, I clutched my rifle tight and exited the vehicle. I knew I had to be fast. I had needed to already be far away from the woods, but my feet wouldn't carry me any further. I stared at the mutilated remains of my father and tried not to throw up again or break down in madness. Come on, you can do this. Just put one foot in front of the other. Do it now. My rational mind screamed at me, trying to override the panic I felt at that moment. I stepped forward an inch at a time, and before I knew it, I was back, staring down at my dad. I breathed through my mouth, not being able to stomach the smell again, and crouched, careful of the sticky and drying blood. I squinted through my eyelashes and patted my dad's pants. The keys were in his left pocket, so as quickly as I could, I stepped to the side and dug through them. My hands clutched around the metal key and I yanked my prize free, nearly stumbling from the force. With the key in my hand, I bolted from the porch back to the truck. I just wish I'd been faster. As I reached the open cab, flesh thudded against wood and I turned, searching for the sound. Movement from above me drew my gaze, and I finally got a good look at what had been chasing me through these godforsaken woods. It was on the roof of the cabin, clinging to the side of the slanted roof with ease. The monster was humanoid, but it crawled on all fours like an animal. Its skin was pale, white like paper, and thick and rough, leathery almost. But what marked it as being something inhuman was its head. It bore ethereal blue eyes that lit up the night and a large angular face that tapered to a point near its mouth. Its mouth, which opened, revealing thousands of minuscule needlepoint silver teeth in rows stretching down its throat. The creature's eyes never left mine and glinted with malicious intelligence. It upturned its too many teeth into a gruesome smile. I didn't think, didn't panic, I just reacted. I raised my rifle and fired. The bullet whizzed past its head and took it in the shoulder. Bright white blood spurted from the wound and splashed across the roof of the cabin to drip down the shingles. It let out a high-pitched shriek of pain and recoiled from the shock. It slid down the roof into the tree line faster than I could line up a second shot. When it broke from my line of sight, I sprinted to the truck, tossed in my bag and rifle, and slid into the driver's seat. Thankfully, the truck started on the first try and the engine roared to life. I flicked on the high beams, threw the truck in reverse, and spun around as fast as I could. The shadow of the forest writhed in chaos as I sped down the trail, going too fast for comfort, but my mind and nerves were shot. It was all I could do not to floor the pedal and speed away as quickly as I could. I was driving recklessly, taking curves too sharply and doing everything in my power not to fishtail into a tree when a thud landed on the roof of the truck, crumpling against the aging metal. I screeched, panicked, and jerked the wheel, trying to throw it off. I spun the wheel too much and clipped an overgrown tree in the process. I tried to overcorrect myself, but only ended up slamming into the side of the truck into the tree line. The truck crunched to a halt, the passenger side crumpling like a bent can as tree branches snapped, sounding wooden gunshots through the forest. Whatever was on the truck was flung to the side as we crashed. It flew off the hood and hit a tree further into the forest. Bones cracked, and when it fell to the dirt, it left a smear of white blood across the bark. I tried to start the truck again, but it just groaned and wouldn't turn over. With a half growl, half groan, the creature picked its bleeding body off the ground and glared at me. its neon eyes glowing even brighter as it shrieked and crawled toward me. I grabbed my rifle and I left the truck. I could follow the monster by its eyes alone, and I perched my rifle on the hood of the truck and took aim. It was slow as it crept toward me, giving me plenty of time to line up the perfect shot. I had my crosshairs centered right between its eyes, and I rested my finger on the trigger, a split second away from firing. The creature let out another scream, much higher in pitch than the others, and my body jerked on its own accord. My hands spasmed, and I squeezed the trigger. My shot went wide, flying off into the woods and thudding into an old tree. That had been my last bullet. My rifle only held 4 shots, and I hadn't brought any extra ammo. I squeezed the trigger again and again. Terror gripped me as it slunk along the earth, leaving a milk-white trail of blood behind it. I threw the gun at it and ran for the truck for the knife in my bag. I wasn't going to let it get me. I wasn't going to end up as food, as a mutilated corpse like my dad. I was going to kill it, or kill myself if that failed. I wouldn't let it eat me. The thing that was on me before I reached the cab, it slammed into the side of the door, pinning me as I was halfway in the door. I lunged for my bag as the monster opened its jaw wide and bit through the metal door like it was cardboard. It ripped a chunk free and spat it on the ground as it eyed me with rage and hunger. My hand closed around my bag and I tore the strings, grabbing the knife that was at the top of the bag. I slid it from its sheath as the creature was poised to bite. I jammed the knife into the hilt of the side of its face, just below its glowing blue eye. It reared back in pain, sending a mind-pounding shriek of pain splitting through my psyche. It stopped my heartbeat for a second as it jumped away from the truck and tried to dislodge the knife stuck in its skull. I thought then I had landed a lucky blow and it was going to leave, that I'd be able to get back in the truck and escape the forest, but more howls joined the first, and 2 more of the monsters slunk out of the shadows. This is where I die. It was the only thought running through my head. I couldn't run from them, couldn't fight them. I was going to die, but I wasn't going to make it easy for them. I grabbed my torn bag and I ran into the woods as fast as I could. I was desperate to escape, but the howls and thuds of too many legs padding through the dirt behind me told me I wouldn't escape. They were close at my heels, and the only thing that saved my life that night was gravity and my own clumsiness. I tripped on a branch and tumbled to the ground as one of them sailed over me, mouth wide as 1,000 needles closed around empty air. It hit the ground a few feet away and turned, eyeing me up. I backpedaled but hit a tree as it lunged a second time. With nothing else in my hands, I brought my bag up as it clamped down, throwing me into the forest floor. Its teeth closed around my bag, ripping the nylon to shreds, but my mini shovel got lodged in its throat, and it couldn't close its mouth all the way. Clothing and food poured out of its jaws, and I scrambled out from under it. My hand hit something plastic as I crawled away from the creature, and even in the dark of the woods, I couldn't fail to make out the bright orange handle of the flare gun. It was a long shot, but it was the last weapon I had, and I clung to it as I stood up and ran away. I didn't get far as the monster chomped through the metal shovel like it was a toothpick and spat out the remains of my backpack. It howled in a rage and ran for me. Knowing I only had 1 shot, I stopped running, dropped to my knees, and fired. Daylight split the night as my eyesight was obliterated by the burning red flare as it streaked through the air and hit the monster in the face. Like it'd been doused in kerosene, the creature went up in a gulf of flames. Its flesh sizzled and popped like grease in a pan as it cracked and blackened in seconds. It howled in agony, screaming such a high-pitched sound that my ears bled. I fell to my knees as my consciousness waned. By the time I rose to my feet and wiped the blood from my ears, it was dead. It was nothing but a charred carcass burning under the crackling fire. The flare still burned, illuminating the night. and showing me that the other two creatures that had crept up on us. I was out of weapons and out of hope, but they stayed back, just at the tree line, watching me and the flaming carcass of their friend. Fire was their weakness, it seemed, and even though I had no more flares, I bluffed them. It was the most reckless thing I could have done, but I had no other options left. I raised the empty flare gun and they flinched. They took a step back and stayed low to the ground like they were ready to bolt. I pressed my luck and took a step forward. They turned and ran as fast as they could deeper into the forest, howling as they did so. As soon as they were out of sight, I ran myself. I ran as fast as my legs would carry me, not caring about the scrapes and scratches from the branches whipping at my face. I only cared about my own survival. I hit the road leading to the highway and ran for hours. There were too many miles between me and the highway. But I didn't care. I just kept running. By the time I hit the pavement, it was daybreak, and I knew I could stop running. But I kept on, because I had nothing else but the run. If I stopped, it would mean accepting what just happened, and I didn't think my mind would survive. I ran until I hit the gas station we stopped at only 3 days ago, what felt like a lifetime ago. The gas station attendant took one look at me, out of breath with bloody, torn clothing, and called the police. He was kind enough to give me all the water I wanted while we waited for the police. I drank it in silence while I sat huddled in on myself, trying to calm my racing heart and not to think. It took the cops nearly an hour to arrive from the nearest town, and when they did, I finally had to tell them my story. They didn't believe me, because of course they wouldn't. I sounded insane, raving about monsters with glowing blue eyes and white blood like a madman. However, the officer was patient and kind, taking down my statement word for word, despite the skepticism on his face. I told them where to find the cabin, the truck, everything. They found it all, right where I told them it would be. But there was no sign of the creature I'd killed, not even ashes. My dad's body was also gone. The only sign it had been there at all were the bloodstains. The police chalked it up to a wild animal attack, attributing my story to be just that, a story by a scared teenager who witnessed an animal kill his father. The reporters, the kids at school, hell, even my mother, they didn't believe me. But I know the truth. I'm not crazy. There's something evil in that forest. Whatever it was, whatever those fucking nightmares were, there's more than one of them, and they burn just fine. If you camp out in the Tennessee forests at night, be careful. Learn from my story, and for the love of God, carry a fire source. Hey everybody, this is Horrific Nights. This is my very first video putting out on YouTube. Please forgive me if anything sounds, the audio is kind of not very good because I'm working with literally no equipment at the moment. But I hope you all enjoy it, and I'll put some information in the description. I have a subreddit called Anything Horror. If anyone likes to write and submit stories for narration, you could always go there and do it. I would love to hear your comments about it. Any suggestions people have. I'm always willing to listen to constructive criticism. So enjoy the video. I hope you guys like it. And I'm excited to put more out there. Good night, guys.